gentlemen, please give a warm applause to our first speaker, Vinay Gupta.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is about merging the physical and the digital. But the first thing that I'm going to discuss is why does this matter? Why does it matter at all what we do? And the answer is very simple. What we do matters. This is a slide, a picture of some folks in London who are protesting right now called Extinction Rebellion. And they've been paralysing London in a mass protest about environmental conditions. They're very concerned about CO2. They're very concerned about the predictions that we're going to see collapses in things like agriculture. And they are absolutely furious that the power structures that they see, the governments, are not doing anything about this. And the feeling that the governments are not doing anything about this is pervasive for a reason. Generally speaking, they're not. The environmental measures which are being taken are generally speaking kind of half-hearted. They don't act as if this is a crisis in the way that you'd act if there was, say, a war. It's just kind of advanced business as usual. 2025, we're going to see huge changes in agriculture. Well, it'll be fine. But it probably won't. The technologists have a response to this, and unfortunately, the response is not really adequate, right? The existing currency systems produce a lot of environmental destruction as a side effect. The cryptocurrency world is no different. There is no real sense of baked-in environmental responsibility in technology really anywhere. We're not seeing an adequate response from government. We're not seeing an adequate response from civil society. We're not seeing an adequate response from technology. Nobody is minding the store, and the problems are really severe. Now, I'm about to make you all really uncomfortable, for which I apologise. But let's talk about money. So, the Extinction Rebellion folks are doing an excellent job making a lot of noise, but they don't really have much of a costed proposal for doing something about the problem. What I'm going to present is the kind of action that a small country could take if they were interested in meaningfully making repairs, right? And this is not about the adoption of some kind of a hair shirt approach where everybody has to cut back on everything simultaneously and maybe we'll have sustainability. This is much more about leaning forward into the future and using the fact that you've got a relatively small, relatively well-organised society to take environmental leadership and demonstrate what's possible. So the first thing is, back of the envelope, it looks to me like the Norwegian oil industry is emitting about 50 tonnes of carbon per Norwegian citizen per year, which is roughly 17 times sustainable levels, right? This is a lot of carbon, right? And that's before you add on any personal consumption. It's also not as if Norway is a poor country. The Sovereign Wealth Fund is about $200,000 per person. The vast majority of that is money that came from the carbon economy over the past 50 years. There's no way around this, right? You guys really are the kind of Saudi Arabia of Scandinavia. So given that that's the starting position and you have a high-tech society and an ability to innovate and you generally feel a keen sense of moral responsibility because you have a very moral society, what would it take to do something about this? And that's what we're going to be discussing. So if we agree that we don't want to make our livings by destroying the world, and I don't think anybody here would raise their hand and say, hey, I'm okay with that. I'm not going to see hands on that. So given that nobody wants it to be the way that it is, what would it look like to meaningfully change it? How do we transform the way that we operate our societies in such a way that you actually get environmental responsibility as an output from capitalism? Because that's what we all want, right? High standard of living, low environmental impact, life continues more or less as it does now. That's our goal state. So in the long run, I believe that we're fine. Right? Now, this is contentious, right? Many environmentalists would disagree, but in the long run I think we're fine, largely because none of the existing energy systems, including oil, are going to be able to outcompete solar panels over the next 2 decades. The solar panels have been falling in price by about 7% a year, every year for 20 years, actually 40 years. They're likely to continue falling in price about that fast, which means they halve in price every decade. They're roughly comparable with grid power in southern countries right now. If they quarter in price over the next 20 years, they'll be cheaper than everything by a huge margin. The world will rapidly decarbonize, inevitably, even if nothing has changed. Now, that doesn't mean that we've got 20 years to wait, because if we continue to pour CO2 into the atmosphere for that entire period without making any real changes, we're still going to wind up with an enormous overshoot and huge amounts of catastrophic damage, particularly to agriculture. So we don't have the option of sitting and waiting for this to happen, but inevitably this does happen. And there are a set of other technologies that are on similar trajectories. Low carbon dioxide meat, which is grown without animals, whether that's vegetable substitutes, genetically engineered meat type products, however we want to do that, there are ways of doing it. Lots of work is being done in it. Burger King in America has just launched an Impossible Burger over the entire chain. It's a vegetarian burger, but it looks like meat. Nobody will eat meat, because it will be more expensive, because the quality will be lower. You might eat steak, but nobody's eating a burger, right? All of these changes are inevitable. Cars in their current form, they're gone, right? You look at things like Teslas, self-driving cars, all the rest of these kind of systems, there's no doubt at all that the car in its current form will be replaced by something which is electric and self-driving. Over the 20-year horizon, the car is going to. Massive insulation of everything in industry, it just pays. We're very bad at doing it, even though it pays, but it pays, it will get done. And then finally, using computers to optimize waste. So this is the thing that I actually have some expertise in. That's the area where I think we can meaningfully do something with this blockchain thing, right? And that kind of optimization of things with computers we've been at for 40 years already. Society couldn't function at all if you turned off the databases. There isn't a single large enterprise that isn't entirely dependent on its internal computer systems. And those enterprises are architected in a way that makes going back to paper literally impossible. So I don't think there's any real possibility that we're going to remain in a position where we don't join those computer systems together, where we don't connect them with environmental imperatives. Inevitably there's a direction of travel here. But whether that takes us 5 years or 15 years or 25 years to get there is the question. And the faster we get there, the less environmental damage we do in the long run. It's a simple set of trade-offs. Right? The faster you adapt, the faster you mitigate, the less damage you do, the less badly the world is damaged by our lifestyles. If we don't want to be the bad guys in the story of the future, those people from the 20th and 21st century, they wrecked everything for the next 200 years. If we don't want to be those people, we have to not be those people. Right? And even though we have these inevitable underlying trends, every single one of these trends could be slowed down by society or accelerated by society. And if it's going to be accelerated by society, we are meant to be the cutting edge, right? We're here to build the future. That's how we got into this room. So, a short break. The solar panels are coming. Nature is very regenerative. There's a decent chance it will be okay. But what do we do in the meantime? How do we make sure that these processes run efficiently? How do we make sure that we reach as far into this environmental future as possible, drag it back into the present? So I have a concrete proposal, which is this. What we've seen over the past 10 years particularly is the rise of this thing we call big data. And big data is basically where an organization grabs all of the data that it can, mashes it with algorithms, and inside of that kind of single fenced area, it produces an enormous optimization of some underlying process. Those optimizations print money. Right? If you think about the profit from, say, Uber or Airbnb, they're valued at somewhere between 10 and 30% of the capital which is under their command. Uber is basically 20% or something like that of the value of every car on the road as part of the Uber fleet. Airbnb, I think the margin is even higher. Right? There are enormous profits being made by running marketplaces that do algorithmic optimization based on large data sets. This is the .com business model to all intents and purposes. You can also see the same thing in politics. The politics of big data is what gives you things like Donald Trump and Brexit. Right? Collect vast amounts of data, process it with algorithms, take effective action to efficiently manipulate society, wind up with outcomes that nobody seems to think they wanted. Right? So that process, we know that it works, but it happens inside of a silo. It's privatized. A single corporation has a data set from which they extract value. What if we did this a different way? So there's no reason that this big data approach has to be confined inside of a corporation. You could run this for an entire society run by a government. You could do it for an entire society or an entire supply chain run by civil society. Imagine if all of the coffee growers in the world put all of their data that was relevant to things like environmentalism and fair trade into a single database. If you took those kind of approaches, which blockchain is often used synonymously with, we could basically process everything that we needed to know out of a single database. And that database, because it's distributed, isn't this kind of, scary big brother government authority kind of a play. It's not that there's an enormous data warehouse which is operated by the state. It's that you wind up with a protocol which is everywhere across the society and which has hundreds of thousands of people reading and writing to it every hour. Those kinds of processes we just about have the technology for, right? Certainly there's enough technology there that you could prototype it. And this kind of universal register approach, it's the same kind of functionality that you have for houses, for cars. These things are already on registries. It's an extension of the way that big data is used inside of corporations already. Nothing about this is completely science fiction. It's taking a set of existing trends and converging them faster than they would naturally converge as a way of building environmental responsibility into capitalism now rather than in 20 years. This has already been done for information. So after the web was invented, we systematically worked our way through and gave every significant piece of information in the world a URL, and we put it all into an enormous shared data silo called the web. Right? The web was open to everybody pretty much. Certainly in the early days before they invented the paywall, it was completely open. It contained vast amounts of information from millions of different publishers, and all of that information was scraped together to give us internet search. An internet search is hugely powerful. Can anybody imagine going back to the time before internet search? When information was hard to find, you had a question, you couldn't find an answer without going to a library, and maybe they didn't even have the right information in the right book. We could never go back. So that is how society will change if we go through the process of extending the paradigm that we used for the web to the physical things. You enumerate all the physical things, you put them in a database. You're at home, you're trying to disassemble your bicycle to make a repair. Your wrench just slips off a bolt and you need a different wrench, right? How are you going to find it? Well, in these kind of systems, you could search local reality for the thing you were missing. Pick up your phone, describe the object you're looking for, hit search, it tells you that your neighbour has one 3 streets down, you contact them, you pay them 50 cents for borrowing the wrench plus insurance, you come back, you fix your bicycle. There's no reason that the physical world has to be this kind of opaque, impossible to search, impossible to understand place. We have enough computer power that we could do for physical objects what we did for information. And the side effects of this are enormous. We can't understand what they would be immediately, but once Google had scraped the web and then an enormous number of books, they were able to build machine translation that worked. And machine translation that worked, I mean, this is an impossible dream realized without even any real fanfare. The fact that you can type a sentence, into Google in English and get a decent version of it in French or German, as good as a human translator in many cases, is an unthinkable side effect. Nobody thought that putting all this information on the internet was going to result in solving the hardest problems of AI, but that's exactly what happened. Completely unexpectedly. So if you went and spidered the matter, if you put everything online, at the point of manufacture, you put the object into a blockchain system. At the point of import, you put the object into a blockchain system. If we did that in a comprehensive way and wound up with a very large database of everything which is here, optimizations which will come out of that which will be as unthinkable as machine translation was until it happened. And I think there's an enormous potential for just discontinuous, unrealized change that would come as a result of this. And it's within reach. This is not an impossible project. So we already have the beginnings of this, right? There are several different large-scale numbering systems for physical things. All of the objects that we buy have barcodes, phones have IMEI numbers, SIMs are all individually identified, cars are all individually identified, they have VIN numbers on them. We've got huge amounts of this data sloshing around in separate silos right now, each one of which has its walls around it, and there's no way to do real cross-correlation across those databases. That's an open data question. There's an outfit in the UK called Open Data Institute, which has been working on those kind of questions for years. But what we haven't had is a vision of a convergence of all of the open databases into a whole of society optimization project. But all of the underlying data is there. It's just a question of joining the pieces together. If I take an object, right, I buy something in a store, on the object is printed all of the information about what's in the object, right? But I can't access that information directly from the barcode because we don't have a system by which companies are required to put all of that information into a database tied to the barcode. If they did, we could immediately know what was in our food in a computerized way. You could then tie that to the supermarket checkout to your credit card so that it would give you an itemized list of what you had bought as soon as you paid for it. All of that data is there. The store knows what you're buying. The store knows your credit card number. It doesn't report what you're buying to your credit card. But if it did, it could immediately trigger a number of alerts. If you have, for example, a peanut allergy and you buy something that you're allergic to, it could immediately warn you. Hey, did you realize you just bought something with peanuts in it? It's this particular cereal. You go through, you take it out of your box, you bring it back to the store, problem solved. That could literally save dozens of lives a year globally, could be hundreds. Right? Similarly for environmental constraints. Right? If you decide that you want to not consume anything that comes from, say, a conflict region, you buy a chocolate bar, the beans in the chocolate bar are potentially from some risky area because the thing was made in a place where they don't have strong law and then imported. You could get an alert about that. You could get a warning. I don't want to do that. You decide that you're going to be vegetarian. It tells you when you buy something with meat in it, hey, you told me that you don't want to eat meat anymore and you've just bought sausages. You have been very naughty. And what this leads to is an approach that I call automated morality. Right? We don't have to decide minute by minute by minute by minute to monitor our own behavior. We have computers. If you decide that you don't want to do something, right, I'm not going to buy any more tobacco, I'm giving up smoking, your credit card can work for you to help you with this. It can provide you with the moral support. It cannot let you buy things. Right? Now, of course, you can always go to the ATM and get out cash and then pay for it, if you have ATMs anymore. But that sort of an approach, how much easier would our lives be when we want to make moral change if we had this kind of backup? Right? You want to reduce your drinking. You tell it how much you're going to buy. It won't let you buy any more, and you're in control of those policies. This kind of stuff is easily possible just by joining together the existing systems we have, and it's much needed. Because we're in a position where the advertisers that want to control your behavior are using enormous databases to get hold of your minds and persuade you to do things that are against your best interests. So we need software that works for us, that allows us to express what our wills are, and then fights back against those advertising systems. Automated morality. First line of defense against being programmed by software. So the case that I want to make here is that the blockchain is a way of us doing collective knowledge. It's a way of us knowing things together. We have these enormous seas of information in society. Because they're balkanized and locked apart, it's incredibly difficult for us to draw meaning by combining all of the available data in a way that allows us to make sensible integrated decisions together. And the only alternative before the blockchain era started was that if we wanted this kind of collective intelligence to work, we had to basically trust the state or Google with all of the data, and then they would put it in their little data fortress and they would process it with their algorithms and they'd tell you what you were allowed to know. In the age of the blockchain, it doesn't have to be that way. You could take all the information that you wanted to be public, you can publish it onto a chain or some closely equivalent system, you can bind all of it together with algorithms, and you can require, under the licenses that are used to access that data, that the algorithms be visible for public inspection. We really have the ability to do that. Copyright law gives people enormous power over their data, and as long as the people publishing the data continue to own the data and it's published under license, those licenses can impose any political conditions that a person cares to impose on the use of the data, including forcing the algorithms into the open. This is a kind of natural parallel to the free software movement and the copyleft license that produced things like Linux and Android. Right? If you publish data into a data commons and it's protected by the right kind of licenses, you can prevent the exploitation of your data against your own interests. And this kind of renegotiation was done for software, creating hundreds of billions of dollars of value for civilization in the form of free software and all the operating systems that we use. Even the Macintoshes are powered by free software. Darwin, which is a fork of, I think, FreeBSD, FreeBSD. So it's not more revolutionary than what we did to software. Most of the internet runs on open source software. Open source software is protected by copyright. The license terms on those copyrights pushed everything into the open, and as a result, the free software movement largely conquered civilization. It's where you get Wikipedia. It's where you get the open internet. We could do the same thing for data. And if it's tightly tied to the payment rails, we have the ability to push this stuff not just into our models of how the world works, but into the actuality of how the world works. We can actually get right inside of the machinery of civilization because the payments are where everything becomes real. And if you can tie this kind of automated morality and open data framework together with the payments as the third rail on that, automated morality, open data, and on the bottom line, this kind of payment rail integration, you have the ability for people to navigate their way through the complexity of the world, so that instead of just having algorithms pushing on you and telling you what to do, you have the ability to push back with algorithms. The ability to create a parity between us as individual moral actors and the forces that would generally tend to control us. And we've seen the impact of this. You can see the political changes in Europe, you can see the political changes in America, political spending guided by databases, powered by Facebook, right? Cambridge Analytica. All of those things are happening because only the bad guys have innovated. Civil society has to innovate to keep up, and I think this is the way that we do it. The other thing about this is that the actual consequences are not nearly as bad as we think they are. Right? I mentioned this enormous oil debt earlier on. 50 tons of carbon per person per year costs about $250 to offset. They plant an equivalent number of trees, they insulate an enormous number of industrial processes. The actual capital cost of offsetting carbon is not that large. It's a big deal in a poor society. Right? If you're in a place like India or China, carbon offsetting for your entire population is an expensive project. If you're in a country like Norway, you could afford to offset your entire global carbon output individually or collectively, and it would be a rounding error on your national spending or your individual spending. So if we have these kind of systems where when you buy goods, it doesn't just tell you whether they're filled with peanuts, it also tells you how much carbon you've just put into the atmosphere, you could also have your software go and buy an equivalent number of carbon offsets immediately. It increases your cost of goods by 0.1% or 1%, depending on what you're buying, but it immediately gives you the ability to audit yourself and know for sure to what degree you're part of the global problem versus being part of the global solution. Suppose that you pay for 3 times the number of offsets that you need. Right? At that point, you're cleaning up other people's messes and you're cleaning up the past every time you act. And these things are not difficult to understand. Right? If you think about the amount of complex software which is behind your credit card as it currently stands, these things are made of software. They could implement any policy that you choose, and environmental sustainability is one of the easiest things to do. You could start in the worst case simply by taking the average carbon intensity of the economy and just taking that amount of money off your card every time you swipe. As you build more and more detailed databases of how much carbon is in different kinds of spending, you get more and more refined offset strategies. But you could just start with a card which paid the average carbon intensity of the economy and work from there. This is not hard to imagine. We could really do this. So I figured out a lot of this stuff was possible in the early days of blockchain, and I started trying to build systems to do it, not working at the whole society scale, but starting with what would it take to gather the information for individual objects and make it available at the point of manufacture. The company is called Materium. We're going to be announcing the first partnership to do this kind of stuff probably in the next 2 weeks. Fingers crossed. But I want to really say that even if we start with individual products, this is not a game for one company to go and build a new economy. That's not how this works, right? If we showcase that it's possible to build these kinds of standards-based approaches, and we publish those standards and we invite people to join us in publishing, and many, many, many different groups of people publish their own information using these kinds of standards-based approaches, What comes out of that is a general transformation in how data is used relative to the manufactured world. And there's really only in the economy manufacturing and services. I don't know how to do this for services, I don't have the right specialities, I've got a pretty good idea how to do it for manufacturing. And what comes out of this is an expectation that every object that you buy or every object that you sell has to be accompanied by a digital twin, a data record, with its contents, so you can check for things like allergens, with its carbon dioxide emissions, so you can basically offset, with indications or warranties that it's manufactured by fair trade, with records of import and export, where did it come from, where is it going, how will it be disposed of at end of life, is it under warranty? And this is not strange. We've done all of this for information, we call it metadata. We're just talking about taking this metadata paradigm and applying it to physical things. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is how I got into this. So 14 years ago, in 2001, I realized that we were really heading into very difficult kind of apocalyptic conditions. Right? It became very clear to me that the carbon dioxide thing was no joke and we were going to run off a cliff because we were incredibly politically disorganized. So in 2002, I invented this refugee shelter called the Hexiar, and I spent the next 14 years trying to get these things mass adopted. Right? It came within minutes of becoming the shelter that IKEA invested in. Right? The IKEA shelter didn't work. Better shelter, it was a disaster. They very nearly had this. I had prototypes of these built in a factory that also manufactured countertop for IKEA. It went to the Red Cross, it went to the UN, it went to the Pentagon, it went to the Department of Defense. The only place that these things were mass adopted, even though they're open source and they cost practically nothing to build over the cost of materials, was Burning Man, where they build something like 6,000 units a year by downloading the plans from the internet and building them. So, I put an enormous amount of time and energy into trying to build a humanitarian solution for the climate refugees that we inevitably knew were coming. Right? Turns out, it's not enough. Right? Even if we mop up after these people, after they get washed out of their homes, even if this thing becomes fully effective and we're manufacturing 10 million of these things a year, it's still not enough. If we don't change things on the head end where the problem actually is, we're not going to get social change. We're going to get huge numbers of people displaced who end up stuck at the bottom of society for the rest of their lives. We have to mitigate the damage on the head end. And the way that we do that is through transparency. We understand the impact that our actions are having on the world. We use software to map our impact. We use software to help us make the right decisions when we shouldn't do something. It warns us that we're doing the wrong thing. And we gradually nudge ourselves back from the abyss. And the unexpected side effects of that, I think, will be as crazily empowering as machine translation or internet search. It's not that we're kind of in this position where we have to reduce and reduce and reduce, and it's kind of hair shirt imperialism. It's not about doing what we're doing now, but doing less of it. It's about leading into the future and accelerating towards this kind of bright green future possibility where we do the hard work of indexing matter, we pull all the metadata together under the right kind of licenses with the right kind of technology, we integrate these automated morality systems into it both individually and socially, and we preemptively, proactively clean up our societies from the richest and most capable places first, where we establish new international standards for how industry operates, and then export those standards globally to bring everybody up to the same level. Thank you.